This is the very end, actually, so let's go set up. Okay, so good morning, everyone. Thank you for coming. I know it's the last day, and it's early for a last day, so I really appreciate it. I'm Ioana. I'm the COO of Game Analytics. I'm going to talk you through some player analysis that we did in China, and usually when you do player analysis, it's always a big question, because if you measure large enough volumes of players, people just start to kind of fall into natural things that you find. People spend average amounts on average, right? So, but in China, we did find some interesting numbers, so I'm going to walk you through that to tell you a bit about who Game Analytics is. We track about 3 billion devices. We have about 14,000 active games worldwide, about 47,000 game developers, and we have an office in London, one in Copenhagen, one in Beijing. Right now, I think we see about, to give you an idea of what that means in player numbers, about 600 million monthly active users in our network that we actually analyzed for this benchmark. Across our 47,000 developers, we looked at 35 genres, and we looked at 11 metrics. Now, these metrics are, of course, how much time people spend in the game, how much they spend, what their conversion rate is, the usual, what you'd expect. What I have in this presentation is pretty much the most kind of interesting findings of that. And we'll start off from genres. If you look at the top 5, top 6 genres between China and the rest of the world, they are quite similar. So there are minor differences, like Chinese players tend to prefer simulation games over arcade games, and they also tend to prefer puzzle games over casual games. These differences are in the range of like 1% of the genre, but it's still notable that even for very large volumes of players, we register a significant difference. So if you are considering going with a particular genre, keep in mind that there may be, things may vary a little, and you may find that genre is not as popular as you think. But the interesting stuff starts to happen a bit later, right? So we looked at how much people spend across genres. And for our DAO, we see about 40 cents. In the rest of the world, we see about 30 cents in China. And this is obviously 25% lower. But if you look at the two graphs, there is a significant variance in kind of the spending profile, right? And we see that in some parts, like this area that is highlighted over here, that is leading up to Chinese New Year, spend starts to increase significantly. But at the same time, while overall revenue increases, the spend per person actually decreases, right? So the explanation that we found for that is in the next slide, right? What is the conversion? If revenue increases but spend per person decreases, there must be a change in the ratios of people spending. More people must be spending less, right? So that's pretty much what we found. We looked at conversion rates, and they're 0.05% in the rest of the world, 0.04% in China. Again, a 20% difference, that generally aligns with the difference in DAO, right? So about 20% less people spend about 25% less on average. It makes a lot of sense. But if you consider the actual size of the market, right? The number of players in China is 35% larger than the total number of players in Europe and America combined. So we are looking at 20% essentially lower transaction, but at a total potential volume of players that is exponentially higher in China than any other market you may be addressing right now. Right, so if you are addressing Western Europe or America, it's almost 3 times larger for any of these individual markets. If you're addressing both, it's still 35% larger than the total. And the interesting other insights that we found here is we then looked at our POO. So okay, let's look at not just DAO, but at individual spend per user and see the potential of those users. And actually, this shows a very different picture. So with the paying users, our POO is 8.1 in the rest of the world and $8 in China. So the difference here is almost insignificant, right? It's 1.25%. But the spending pattern varies greatly. Where in China we see some people that spend a lot of money, And but the majority of people will spend a bit below kind of what we see the average in the rest of the world. So for variance, we have the maximum in China is actually 9.8, whereas the maximum in the rest of the world is 8.8. So you start to see significant difference in terms of the high spenders. And for those of you who are kind of IAP driven in your games, investing in findings, those high spenders in China can prove very, very profitable. There may be a lot more of them, and they will spend they may spend more at a significant rate compared to players in the rest of the world. And we looked at transactions as well to see if kind of this bears out the difference, and we did find actually slightly more transactions in the rest of the world than in China, so about a 4% difference. We did find that, no, actually, I'm actually wrong. Sorry about that. Actually, these numbers are inverted, and I do apologize, but if you see, it's actually China has, if you look at the graph on the bottom right, China actually has more transactions, and what the graph emphasizes is exactly that. Actually, people in China will make, it's 123 to 118, it's actually a 4% difference in favor of China in terms of number of actual transactions, right? So again, this tends to actually bear out to what we found in the previous slide fairly well, in that the spend is pretty much aligned, and per paying user, China can be a little bit higher. And this is where we start to look at engagement and start to see, okay, now players spend, right? But for free-to-play games, do they actually spend time in the game? What is it that, like if I monetize with ads, what does that mean for me? How do I actually get to grow a player base? And we found some very interesting things over here. So session time is much higher in China. It's higher by 48%. And you can see that. So the black part at the bottom of the graph is the rest of the world, and the red is China. Like, that gives you a very clear idea that people just play more. And a 48% difference is very significant, right? That gives you time to show people more ads. That changes the way that you do level design, potentially. Like, you may want to do longer levels so people don't churn through them very quickly. It has a big impact. And if we look at also the number of sessions that they have, right? So there's time per session, there's number of sessions. Number of sessions is actually a bit lower. So they will play fewer sessions, but play more time per session on average. If you compare the two, the difference is actually in favor of China compared to the rest of the world, in the sense that even if you combine the fact that they play fewer sessions, the difference in time played is larger, so it will compensate for the fact that they play overall fewer sessions. So it's clear that we have, gamers in China, like proper kind of serious gamers. And this is where I said we started to find something very interesting. If you look at the pattern of people playing, the black, again, the black in the graph is the rest of the world, where you see, players, then a little spike at the weekend, goes back, a little spike at the weekend. If you look at China, like, there's almost nothing during the week, huge spike at the weekend, right? So we're like, wait, what does this mean? Our interpretation of it is that actually people churn, this is stickiness, right? So how often do people return to a game? How often do they play the one game in the same month? With China, it's actually, they play many games, the stickiness is very low, so people play games, they don't really return to the game, except on the weekend where they have a few titles that they may always return to. So it's like through the rest of the week, I will test out 30 games. I'll spend a session, like a longer session in each. I'll find the game I like, and then I'll play that game every weekend. All of the other games are getting very little for me. Right? I do not care. I tried it. I don't care. I'm not coming back. But when I like a game, I will be there. I will spend a lot of time in that game. Right. So there's this extremely high variance. Of course, what you see at the very right of the graph is that over the holidays, this is Chinese New Year, that behavior changes. Players have more time to spend in games, so they come back more often because that's essentially an extended holiday, right? So they will change their behavior over the holidays. This also means don't test your game over the holidays and think that if you have great retention, that you're going to have great retention the rest of the time. It might change immediately after. You might spend a lot of money on a UA campaign to get players for Chinese New Year, and those players might be gone virtually the next week. So make sure that you speak to somebody local who can kind of help you plan your UA to account for cases like this, so you don't have situations where you spend a lot of money and you don't see the return. Okay, so that is essentially retention or stickiness looks at a whole month. We try to look at also retention for like day 1, day 7 to see, okay, well, what happens? How do I know, right? Like which type of game I am? Like when can I figure this out? And also for retention day 1, we also see that the numbers are very different. In the rest of the world, averages are about 30%. We know that in order to have good retention for your game, right, the type of retention you go to a publisher with, it has to be over 40%. So obviously the average is a little lower than that. But for China, it is significantly lower. It is 18% lower. So this seems to, again, confirm our thinking that people do not come back to the game after the first session if they don't like it. But if you do have something, like again, the same holiday behavior is also shown here. So if your game is popular and you have found a way to make it work, the holidays can be a great way to do short-term monetization. So it's not necessarily a great time to do UA, but it can be a great time to show people ads because they will still be more likely to come back over that kind of 7 to 10 day period. And where we see that, you know, it starts to hit the fan, it's around retention day 7. So if you look at retention day 7, it kind of brings together everything that we spoke about. If people don't come back, retention day 7 is about half in China compared to the rest of the world. So that means that if players haven't come back on day 7, which is what we were saying, if they haven't come back to your game on the weekend, they're not coming back. Like you lost them. You basically have 7 days at most to engage the players. If not, they are lost. Okay. So this was a big surprise to me in terms of how quickly it drops off and kind of how visible this difference is. Okay, so what do you actually do with this information? These are, you know, our suggestions or what we think, but again, talk to the experts, talk to Mavista, talk to Integral. They will be able to help you navigate the landscape. Our suggestions are find the players who are willing to pay a lot of money. Like there is money to be made in high spenders in China. There's a lot of them. They spend a lot in the game. They can be extremely profitable. They can be like super whales, right? Play the long game if you're monetizing with ads, which means don't expect that you'll have high retention in the beginning. Really experiment. You want to get to the point where instead of being one of those games that churns, you are one of the games that people come back to every weekend. So take the time to experiment. Don't expect to be successful from the very beginning, and really go for it and optimize the game until you find that you're one of the games that truly spikes. And use I&P economies of scale. People pay less. There's many more people. Try to make that work for you, and consider that as part of your UA strategy as well. You may need to pay less to get a user in, but you may want to go for volume, and if you cannot get the high spenders. That's it.